welcome to the April 12th, 2023 City Council work session and the meeting of the Urban Renewal Agency. Thank you for joining us in this hybrid meeting format. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. And thank you again for joining us. And with that, open the Urban Renewal Agency meeting and turn it over to the manager.
Thank you. Today's conversation about downtown urban renewal is actually a continuation of where we started on Monday. I think we're back with some more specific information. I believe Will's gonna kick us off.
Thank you. I'm Will Dowdy, Community Development Director, back to continue this conversation. We've heard a lot from you on Monday in the shortened time that we had, and we tried to field as many of the comments and questions that we could. And we'll start out by answering the ones that we took note of, and if there's other comments or questions, we'll be happy to answer those. So with that, hand it off.
Thanks, Will. So one of the questions that came up on Monday was about the emerging projects focus area. So with regards to that, we heard questions about what is on the list and how a project would move forward. So we'll start with what's on the list. The project examples included in your packet reflect projects that were identified by community members and downtown stakeholders during the outreach we conducted last fall, as well as projects that have been previously discussed by the agency board. The description of the emerging projects focus area is purposefully general to allow for agency board flexibility. We recommend maintaining your flexibility to fund projects as opportunities arise and priorities shift. For example, if there were federal funding for open spaces or state funding for a community facility you were interested in locating downtown, we might want to be ready to provide matching funds without going through a 6-month process to amend the plan. Next, I'll walk through a potential process for selecting and funding a project. Say a counselor wants to talk about an emerging project like redevelopment of the park blocks. A work session would be scheduled to discuss the topic. At this work session, you could decide not to pursue the project, or you could give direction to return after completing additional research, like funding options, feasibility studies, market analysis, etc. There would then be at least one more work session to discuss the potential project. At this work session, you could decide again not to move forward with the project, or you could decide to have staff do more research and return with more information. This could happen as many times as is needed and desired by the agency board. Or if at the stage you are ready to move forward with the project, you'd provide that direction to staff, and it's at this point that you would actually allocate funding to the project. And then that funding would be appropriated through your regular budget process. To give you another idea of how money actually gets allocated, I'll walk through how the Development Fee Assistance Program would be established. With housing a clear priority, we'd get started on this project as soon as we could. We'd present a program proposal to you at a work session with ideas for program parameters. We'd present ideas for eligibility criteria, distribution process. For example, should the assistance be offered through an annual request for proposals? Should it be an ongoing process? And we'd also present options for allocation amount, including whether to allocate it all in year one or divide it over multiple years. At that work session, you could either request changes or more information, which we'd bring back to you, or you could direct us to move forward with implementation. And at that time, the agency board would determine how much funding to allocate to the program. Once you did that, the funding would be formally appropriated through your regular budget process. And finally, we begin implementation and report back to you on the program use. If demand is exceeding the allocation or the program is being underutilized, we'd come back to you to talk about the program and whether there's a need to pivot the strategy. We heard on Monday that we need to set goals for housing downtown and stick to them. You know that we have a goal of 1,000 units of housing in downtown in the housing implementation pipeline. We're on track to knock that out of the park. We already have 1,000 units of housing in the pipeline and starting to come out of the ground. However, it's located in the 5th Street area in the riverfront. We now need to set a new goal for housing in the core. Even with the new 1,000 units, we still have unmet housing demand, and focusing on housing in the downtown core can not only help create supply, but will also help us address our goals for a safe, clean, and accessible downtown. To determine what a new goal should be, we need to know what resources we're working with, and we need to coordinate with the housing implementation pipeline work. We'll start that work and we can come back to you with the goal. There was also a request for more information on what kind of cost we're looking at for new housing downtown. In speaking to a handful of local developers, they're seeing new construction costs of about $300,000 to $350,000 per unit in new multi-unit developments. We don't have local estimates for office to residential conversion, but based on the limited research we were able to do, we estimate it would be about $150,000 to $200,000 per unit to convert uses. And that does not include the cost of acquiring the property. In developing the draft proposed amendment, the Development Fee Assistance Program assumes costs for government-imposed development fees would be about $10,000 per unit. This includes system development charges and permit fees, which recently have been about $7,000 to $9,000 per unit. And it also accounts for possible electrical system upgrades. The downtown electrical grid has a lot of redundancy built in, which makes it more resilient, but also makes it more difficult to know what upgrades will be required for the development of any given site. I'll now hand it off to Maurizio, who will touch on maximum indebtedness and the plan duration.
Thanks, Amanda. Good afternoon. My name is Maurizio Badalico from the Finance Division. And on Monday, Amanda reviewed different amounts of maximum indebtedness and the estimated plan duration to achieve each of those levels. Today, I'm going to provide some additional information about how maximum indebtedness and plan duration are correlated in the draft proposed plan amendment. Urban renewal districts are legally required to include maximum indebtedness limits in their urban renewal plans. Maximum indebtedness is a spending cap on expenditures of tax increment revenue over a period of time. Within the maximum indebtedness limitation, the agency board has the ability to fund projects either with cash on hand or by issuing debt. The plan duration is an estimate of the amount of time needed to reach maximum indebtedness and pay off any debt issued. The estimated number of years for each scenario is based on a number of financial assumptions that may play out differently over time. Some examples include the need to issue debt, the amount and timing of debt issuance, and the debt interest rate. And also tax increment revenue growth rates are all variables that will impact the plan duration. The actual number of years the plan remains active may vary from current estimates depending on how actual events unfold over the coming years. A relevant example of this is happening right now in the downtown district. The 2016 plan amendment originally estimated that tax increment revenue collections would be in place through FY27, but current projections show that the final year of tax increment collections will actually be FY24. The reason for this is because the original financial forecast in 2016 assumed borrowing a large amount of money in the early years of the plan to fund projects. However, actual project timing was later than anticipated, and this resulted in the need to borrow significantly less money, resulting in much lower interest costs and a shorter plan duration.
Thanks, Maurizio. The final piece we'll touch on today is the proposed spending scenarios and focus areas. On Monday, you raised questions about wanting to spend more on housing. I want to be clear that the amounts in each of these buckets are estimates for planning purposes only. They provide guideposts to staff and generally articulate council priorities. The actual amounts in each bucket will be determined as you make decisions on plan implementation, like the processes I just walked you through. You'll be making these decisions incrementally. For example, let's say you wanted to move forward with scenario B. If the plan is amended with that scenario, the only thing in this row that gets locked in is the $40 million increase to the spending limit. You'll make decisions as to how much is allocated to housing when you establish the Development Fee Assistance Program and set an amount to make available, and also when you approve the purchase of a property. When you make a decision on Development Fee Assistance, you could choose to allocate the $7 million we've estimated, or you could choose to allocate 10 or 15 million. The amount spent on land acquisition will depend on a number of factors. If the owner is willing to sell and what the agency board is willing to pay. To give you current cost examples, the Wells Fargo building is currently for sale for $3 million, and the Sykes building and its parking lot are for sale for $10 million. And finally, that $8.1 million estimated in emerging projects only gets allocated if you provide us direction to move forward with one of the emerging projects. With that, I hope we were able to answer some of your questions and are here to answer any more that you may have for us.
Thank you very much. There's a lot that you said today that was actually compelling, and the Mauricio's comments about we hit our maximum 3 years earlier than we thought is kind of an interesting. I don't think I'd heard that before, and that was pretty interesting, and very much appreciate your explanation again about the spending buckets and where we are. So, are there counselors with questions needing clarification? Alan, take it away.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. You can hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for this presentation, a little bit more clarity, several further questions. So any project that gets money spent from this Urban Renewal Fund would require an affirmative vote by the council, and there's no default inclusion in the plan. It would require, for it to move forward or to be even studied, a affirmative action by the council. Is that right?
Most of it, there is smaller projects for the physical improvements for safety and comfort. So like putting lighting in alleys or fixing sidewalks, those smaller projects, if they're under 250,000, staff would be able to pursue, and anything more than that, we would come to the agency board. But everything else would require another agency board touch point.
Good clarification. I think that's appropriate. And so I'm wondering what the allocation process and what the purpose or meaning of that. I recall previously we reallocated money from other projects to the farmers market, and we had to vote on that. So I'm wondering what the meaning or purpose or the efficacy of the allocation of dollars is in moving forward. And that's not in the motion, right? It's just
correct. So the 2016 amendment, the agency board set spending caps for each of the projects, which was why we had to come back for the farmers market. And we are not proposing putting spending caps for the project, since there's a lot we don't know.
And so that kind of brings up, what's the intent and purpose of attachment D, which has all the preliminary project implementation information? So
Yeah,
just information only?
That's a good question. So the purpose of attachment D was just to give additional information on what implementation could look like. The requirements, so the Oregon statutes require us to produce a report that goes along with the proposed plan amendment, and that report is required to give estimates of allocations, which is why we go through the exercise of putting estimates for each of the focus areas.
Okay, and so I guess what I heard from the council and my own intent was and I agreed with Councilor Groves and other councilors that said that we should be shifting this, and the highest interest for this funding should go to housing. Option B doesn't reflect that at all, and option A sort of does. So I'm wondering, what are we going to do with the options today? Nothing?
So we're asking for direction on feedback on the spending scenarios. If the agency board wants to see more money allocated to housing in our estimates, we can certainly do that. We can incorporate that into the draft amendment and the draft report.
I think just to clarify though, you could end up spending $40 million just on housing. You're not limited. This has just been put out there as an idea of how it could go.
Yeah.
Right. So the motion needs to be as to the spending limit or the time, and not the allocation, right?
Correct.
So if we wanted to have $30 million, that would be one way to do it, or 10 years of spending limit would be another way to do it. Correct?
The proposed motion, Lauren's coming to the table also, which is great. The proposed motion is around the 3 spending proposals, the spending scenarios, but you certainly could have a motion that speaks to maximum indebtedness. It's just the three options that you have is how the motion is crafted.
That's accurate. So if council is interested in identifying the agency board is interested in identifying a particular amount of total maximum indebtedness and not necessarily one of the spending scenarios, one of the buckets, we have a motion ready for you that you could just say, direct staff to move forward with the plan amendment process using total maximum indebtedness of 40 million, 30 million, 50 million. And that would be the number that they would move forward with. That would be the number that they would take to the overlapping taxing districts for concurrence. And then the board can always give additional direction as to how that money is spent. And there will be a number of touch points about actually spending the money before it is spent.
Yeah, I guess at this point, I am not ready to allocate even in a perfunctory manner to any of these buckets without a lot more discussion about what we would be doing with it and how what the specifics would be. So I would encourage the council president to put forward a motion that related to maximum indebtedness without allocating funds, but signaling the intent that the council to have the vast majority of it going towards housing. And then we can have that conversation as we move forward, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. I have Mike and then Greg and then Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. I tend to agree with Alan on his final point there. But a couple of questions for staff. One, in scenario B, the additional 13 million, did I hear you the other day say that was for administration and finance costs?
Yeah, so that's for project delivery administration. So that's and for borrowing costs. So that's for staff time for any support work to support the project. So like appraisals, professional services, things like that.
You want to break those percentages down at all? What would roughly be the percentage for administration?
We're looking for the information.
Sure, and the only reason I bring that up is because a lot of the times the knock against tax increment financing is the siphon effect of paying for administration, and I just would rather have a hard number or something close to an estimate of what part of the additional indebtedness would go towards administration.
Yeah, so it's most of it goes towards project delivery and administration, and that can include like legal and consulting fees, any property management, just all architectural engineering, all activities like that to support delivering on the actual projects.
And most is just more than 50%, or most is 80, 90%
of the project.
Of that additional 13 million out of 40.
Yeah, I would like 12 million of the 13 million.
Thank you.
Only 100,000 is going towards debt issuance costs.
Cool. Okay.
Again,
Excellent
that's
news.
an estimate. All of these are estimates.
Totally got that. Not a hard number. Certainly not something to hold to, but we have at least a good idea of what would be spent there. When using tax increment financing as a part of a housing development, typically what percentage of a unit's construction cost is paid for with tax increment financing? I know that's a pretty wide open question.
I mean, if we're using the numbers, the estimates we have now, so if we're 300,000 per unit and we're probably covering $10,000 per unit.
That's the math I was going to, was that with $14 million at 350 for new construction, we're talking about 40 units for the whole 14 million. So I'm just wondering.
So we would be covering $10,000. We estimate that we would be able to support $10,000 per unit. Whereas the full construction cost would be 300,000, which is an estimate of what the developer would be
Right.
paying for.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Greg and then Randy.
A couple of quick questions here. So based on what Alan just talked about as far as a motion for maximum indebtedness, if we went up to scenario C and said $50 million maximum indebtedness, 19 years for the extension of the district, would that mean that we could also come back with a smaller amount? Say we came back to 45 million or back to $40 million and not spend all of that particular money. In other words, it would just be a cap and not it be anything that it would be firm. We wouldn't exceed 50 million, but we would be able to spend up to 50 million.
Correct. So moving forward, if you wanted to move forward with the $50 million increase right now, all that's telling us to do is take that idea to the overlapping taxing districts and for public outreach. And when we come back in June, you could choose to just move forward with the $40 million. And then whatever the spending limit increase is set at, that's just a max. You could choose to spend any amount less than that you wanted.
So in terms of the bucket allocations, if we spend, say, $14 or $16 million on housing, what kind of assurances can we build in for a percentage of that housing to be affordable housing based on the AMI?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's the kind of conversation we'd want to have with you once the plan was amended, especially when we're setting up the development fee assistance program. That's one of the parameters that we would be looking at, whether there's criteria like that. If we wanted to acquire property and then offer it for reduced cost, we can have strings tied to, we could have strings tied to that, that whoever got the property would have to build housing affordable to a certain income level. So those would be decisions that you would be making down the line as the plan gets implemented.
And that's something that, you know, before we get too far deep off into the plan, that I would like to have those assurances, because right now what we're looking to build or what's being proposed, and my understanding is mostly are going to be market rate developments, and that's not nearly closing the gap or meeting the need that we have in terms of affordability. So if we're going to use public money, I want to use public money in the appropriate way, and that is to provide affordability for people who are at a certain percentage of AMI that cannot afford, full market rate for rents.
Okay. Thank you. Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you for the additional clarifications. That helps a lot. I can see now I was spending too much time focusing on the individual buckets rather than the bigger picture. In fact, for my colleagues, I came with a motion prepared that boosted the amount put in the housing bucket, but now I'm more inclined to agree with where Councilor Zelenka is to just put a dollar amount, and then we can work with the details later. So anyhow, that's what I intend as council president to make as a motion. And we'll see how the discussion continues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I see Alan has a second round. Does anybody want a first round? You wait till the motion. Okay, Alan, go ahead for your second round.
Thanks, Mayor. Right when I put a bite in
Sorry.
my mouth. Good timing. So, it seems kind of awkward to say the dollar amount since we don't know what the definitive project list is. That's why I was thinking about it kind of differently, which is, why don't we set a term for how long we want this to go forward? That creates the dollar amount that we can work with. And if we just said, okay, it's 10 or 11 years that we want to work forward, then we get the dollar amount. If we said 10, it's probably gonna be what, 29.5 million or something like that. And then figure out what we're going to do with with it later. And because then it's a kind of a step function or a step process where first you have to have the money, then you figure out what you want to do. But some people think you should figure out what you want to do first and then allocate the money. And so this seems a little backwards to me, but I understand where we are. I would feel a lot more comfortable if we had a list of here's what we want to do. Therefore, this is the amount of money that it takes. And then we should allocate that amount of maximum indebtedness. But I don't think we're actually going to get there. So I'd support, a 10 or 11 year, $11 $30 million one at this point. I think starting small and growing it, and with the full understanding that we could grow it later if we need to or want to, it's not need, it is the appropriate way to go on this, especially since we don't have a definitive project list.
Okay, I have Matt and Jennifer for first rounds.
Thanks, Mayor. I would submit just the conversation Monday and the conversation today and what's in front of us in our packet indicates pretty clear legislative intent that there's a desire to have the biggest increase or biggest investment in housing. That's really clear to me. I do want to clarify a piece that was brought up Monday. I can't recall who brought it up, but moving away from housing and back to the emerging projects list in attachment D, could you clarify for me, please? Because it's my understanding that these are just suggestions, that we're not locked into anything on here. And just because something is on here doesn't mean that gives it the green light to be discussed. If something emerges and is not on here, it could still fall into this bucket. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. That's helpful.
Okay, Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks. So that last thing that Alan just said really resonated with me, only in the opposite direction. Sorry, Alan. But the idea that we should think about this in time instead of money. And one of the things that I'm sure many of us have learned being on council is how long something takes to go from an idea and everyone's, yes, let's do that thing, to it finally getting done and bills have to be paid, which makes me lean a little towards a longer time frame. So in the higher two scenarios rather than the lower, because 10 years is almost nothing in getting something off the ground, right? So I don't know if that's helpful to our poor council president who has to make a motion, but I think that the smaller one is probably not as realistic now, thinking of it that way. And I also really liked what you said about, we don't know what the future is going to bring. So having some funds to be able to support a project that we maybe even don't know we want to do right now today. We don't have to, obviously, just because we don't have to spend the money just because we have it, but being able to take advantage of those types of things, like the steam plant that we want to put money to, we didn't necessarily know we wanted to do that before. So that would be my preference. It's one of the two larger ones.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to the council president in a minute. I think we're probably ready for a motion, but I just wanted to say that I'm grateful for what Jennifer just said, because I'm more in favor of a longer timeline and a higher number, because I agree. I think it just takes a long time. And if we're looking at housing, we see how long it takes for housing to get off the ground, and that makes sense. And just reiterating really the comments I made last time and this time, that you have a housing implementation pipeline. It talks about investing in housing downtown, and this is, we just know how many rocks there are in the road to get from the idea of building housing to actually building housing. So I would encourage council to think of the latter two, recognizing that you're going to go out to the other partners. You'll get feedback on whether that's too high, too low. You can adjust it when it comes back, and it's really it's a starting point for the conversation. It doesn't have to be the final landing place. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Mayor, we have two counselors with their hands in the air.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't see
waving
either one
frantically
of them.
on the,
Sorry.
Zoom screen.
Thank you. It's on a white background. I just didn't
It's
quite
hard to
see.
see.
So I'll turn to Lindsay first, because she hasn't. Oh, I guess neither of you have had a turn. Okay, Emily and then Lindsay.
Thank you. One question, the project list. do we have to make a project list before we approve the increase? Because I thought that if the list didn't include something, we couldn't do it later.
So
Like,
the
We
project
don't
is-
have the steam plant on our list now. But I
the
guess,
steam, yeah, the steam plant's in the Riverfront Urban
I
Renewal
know.
Plan. Yeah, okay, yeah. So, projects can qualify. So that's why we've used pretty general language, like community facility is pretty open-ended. We provided examples just so you could understand what that could be. But if something qualified under community facility, that could move forward. If something qualified under open space, it could move forward.
okay, that's wonderful. That's very helpful. Obviously, we're not ready at this point to make a list of projects, but we've learned we have to be pretty nimble. And so the more space we have to be nimble, the better. I don't like to spend money that, that we don't have to, but we need to spend some money downtown. We need the housing. I'm more inclined, and this is a surprise to me, but I'm more inclined to go for the 50 million because things are costing so much more than we expect. I wouldn't want us to be limited and then have to go back to find funds that we may or may not find. So I think starting with a higher amount gives us a lot more flexibility as to what we can actually do. And I think that's really important, that we have that flexibility and that we have the resources that we need. I agree that housing is the biggest need and we need to put money into that. I would not want to eliminate the other two categories, realizing that we can shift the money between the buckets. The buckets are sort of imaginary. But I just want to remember that to have a good place to live, it's not just that you have a unit to live in, it's that the unit is in a place you want to live. And that includes safe sidewalks and lighting and maybe a nicer park blocks. So I don't want to lose track of the fact that a good place to live is more than just places to live in. So at this point, I'm really in favor of the 50 million. I don't think the timeline is that much to be concerned about because as we just had the example, our timeline got to be much shorter than we had anticipated. So I think it's the money amount and we really need to find revenue and we need to keep downtown working. And let's remember, it is our biggest source of revenue. That's where the most of the property tax money comes from. So although I have not been in favor of urban renewal because of taking it out of the general fund, I think that in this case, we're actually making a prudent financial decision by saying this money can go towards downtown. So I hope you'll support that. Thank you.
Thank you. Lindsay.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to staff and for Monday's presentation, as well as coming back and clarifying for us today. I am going to be really, really brief that I'm also in support of a higher level of investment. I think it's very, very important right now to make some serious moves in our downtown. And I also agree with Emily that housing, obviously very, very important, but physical improvements, safety improvements in our downtown are crucial. And so I am in support of the 40 or possibly 50 million investment so that we have that flexibility and time to really take care of our downtown. And I think the intent and spirit of this tax increment is to increase our revenue over time, and making bigger investments will enable us to do that. So thank you again. I look forward to seeing what happens today.
Hey, thank you. Greg.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I want to chime in with Councilors Leach and Semple. I think that we need to go with a higher amount. I'm willing to go with $50 million if the council president is willing to make that motion. And I do think that the time limit is important as well, because as we all know, these projects take time. There's always a monkey wrench that's thrown into them that extends the amount of time that they need to be developed and completed. And I think that we need to have the maximum wiggle room as possible to do that, particularly when we're talking about housing, but also in talking about improvements to infrastructure like lighting and other infrastructure investments.
Okay, thank you. And Alan, one more round.
Yeah, I was hoping for a little compromise here. 50 million, 20 years of extension of the urban renewal district is a bridge too far for me. Maybe if it was all going towards all housing, but I don't see that as happening. I would hope that we could settle on a compromise of 40 million. I also kind of wonder, so the next step of this is to go shop this out with other jurisdictions and get input from stakeholders as well as the public. And if you were bringing this to me, the first question I'd ask is, well, what do you want to spend the money on? And right now the answer is, we don't know. But we have this list of potential things, and we don't have an allocation of how it moves between the buckets. So I'm kind of wondering how that conversation is actually going to go and what we're going to say to people. And then again, what does attachment D have how does that play a role in this outreach and discussion that we're going to have?
Counselor, thank you for the question. I think what we would start with is say that we had initially drafted an allocation, and that included if it was the $50 million scenario, that it included X amount for each of these categories, and we would explain what was included in those categories. And the first step is to explain that those categories are what's enabled by the plan. And so without talking about how many dollars go into each, we would say this is the extent of what's enabled by the plan. Anything that's within that is enabled. Anything that's outside of that is not eligible, and that's the starting place. The next thing we would do is say that council has, or the agency board has been very clear that housing is the #1 priority, and that our first action working on such a plan would be to come back, as Amanda described, with the two key elements of the housing plan, which is talking about development support, or talking about the city fee assistance or government fee assistance, and then talking about land acquisition. And so we would be starting with those, and the expectation would be that a lot of the funds, and to be determined exactly how much, but that's where the agency board will be prioritizing their investment.
So with that attachment, this is a bit problematic for me in that the Eugene Conference Center and creation of a new cultural performance venue are specifically mentioned in here. We haven't had any conversation about either of those. Those are big ticket items. If moved forward by folks that don't have necessarily an interest that the council seems to have in moving housing forward, those two things are going to be at odds and potentially reduce the amount dramatically, potentially, the amount of housing that this ends up creating. So this list, I'll just go on record, those two things I think should be stricken from the attachment D at this point and have without more conversation in the urban renewal district as potential projects.
Yeah, we can take those out. Those were included as they have come up in conversation before, and we knew there might be questions about what a community facility would be. So we thought we'd provide examples, but we can just easily as take those out.
Thanks.
All right, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. With all due respect to my friend Alan, when asked the question what we'd be spending on, I think we're saying very, very loudly and clearly the answer is housing. And I think we're sending a signal that we're very serious about it. And this is precisely why I hope my friend, the president of the council, will make the motion for 50 million, because he'll have my vote. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So just a little bit of clarification, just following on Alan's last comment about wanting the convention center struck from the list. I guess I don't
It would still be eligible
Okay.
if
Okay.
someone, a counselor wanted to
Okay.
keep exploring it. We just would remove the examples and.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
keep it
Thank you.
general.
I just want to make sure
Yes,
that's,
yeah.
we're not just closing that door because he asked. Okay. Thank you. All right. I'm going to turn it over to Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. As council president, I move to direct the agency director to begin the process of amending the downtown urban renewal planning using total maximum indebtedness of $50 million consistent with the draft plan and report included in attachments A and B.
Second.
Any other further questions? All in favor, please raise your hands. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 opposed. 1. Okay, thank you. That passes. Thank you. Well
Mayor,
done.
can I point of
Yeah.
privilege, explain my
Yes.
vote?
Yes, you may.
Yeah. If it were $40 million, I would have voted for it. My preference was 30 million, but I think 50 million's a bridge too far since we don't really know what we'd spend it on. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the presentation and the work. And I'm very glad that we're moving forward. So appreciate all your efforts. And with that, we close the meeting of the Urban Renewal Agency and we'll prepare for return to a council meeting in a minute.
Time for copy.
Run,
By sprint.
run.
Yeah, we'll be done by the time you get back.
Yeah. Mm.
Their duties as a sign. Climbing on the floor.
It's like we called each other.
We're pretty good, huh? Don't we have this back there?
Okay, I think with that, we reopen and open the meeting of the Eugene City Council. And with that, I will turn it over to the city manager.
Thank you, Mayor. We were here, Twyla Miller and I were here before your break talking about possibilities for a revenue team. Got some great feedback in the meeting and since then, and I think Twyla is gonna just give us a slightly revised proposal that we think meets the intent of.
Yeah, sounds good. Great. Thank you, Sarah. So good afternoon, Mayor and Councilors. Twyla Miller, the Chief Financial Officer for the city. Just a few slides here. To start, you've seen this one before. This really describes our process when we're looking at new revenues. Again, we started in that upper left quadrant where we're identifying the problem that we're trying to solve or the service delivery issues. We gather information and do research. We get to an evaluation stage where we usually engage some sort of a revenue committee or team. And then we bring back information to council for a policy decision. So as Sarah said, based on our February discussion, we've made a change to our proposal that was in your attachment to your AIS. And so the feedback really was around defining the scope of the problem or the scope for the revenue committee charge. So we've added in the proposal a series of work sessions to discuss and finalize the scope of services that would become the charge of the revenue team. So these may be things like we've discussed before, things we funded on a one-time basis, such as housing, unhoused, climate, downtown, those sorts of things. The rest of the proposal really stays the same. A broad revenue team with counselors, budget committee members, community partners, and with the deliverable being a report to the city manager. This here is really just showing all the elements of our budget process. So on April 26th, the city manager will present her 23-25 biennial budget proposal. As part of the budget committee deliberations in May, there will be staff presentations on some of the pieces in the budget, including some of the items that we funded on a one-time basis to understand the history of funding coming out of the Great Recession, understanding what is proposed in the 23-25 budget, and then also understanding if there are gaps. So that will happen in May. So this proposal is really adding council work sessions. So in May and June, having some council discussion and really, again, defining the scope of the services and the costs that the revenue team would decide or deliberate and develop a proposal on. And then the revenue team would begin to meet after that work is finished at council. So either in June or hopefully starting no later than July. And so that team would meet in the June, July timeframe through October, deliver a report to the city manager, and then we would come back to council in November and December for further revenue discussions. And again, this is just a reminder, this is really a one step in a longer process. So we're looking at the near-term needs in the 23-25 biennium, but we also understand there's a longer term sustainable budget conversation we need to have. That will include revenue as we look out into the future, but this revenue team is the first step in that process. So that's really all I have for you today. We can open things up for questions.
Thank you very much. And let me just see who shows up on the screen here. Hey, thank you so much. And I have Matt, okay, and Alan, you're ready to go.
Thank you, Mayor. I have a couple questions, several questions. Is the revenue team a subcommittee of council, or is it a subcommittee of the budget committee, or neither?
It's neither.
Yeah.
It would be a team. How we've done it in the past is it's a team that's essentially advising me. If it's a direct council committee, it has a whole nother layer of requirements for you to appoint, set a timeline, public meetings. So how we've done it in the past is it's generally you cooperate, the mayor cooperates in terms of, participates in terms of choosing members, but then staff would be staffing that. They'd be giving the recommendations to me and I'd be sharing those with you and making a recommendation to you.
So they're not public meetings?
They wouldn't necessarily need to be. No.
It wouldn't need to be, okay. Unless a majority of council decided to participate, then it would be.
Correct. Right? Yeah.
Yes, but the number of counselors isn't going to be what dictates it's a public meeting or not. It's the type of recommendation they're making. So it could have far fewer than a majority of council and still be a public body if the recommendation is being made directly to council.
Okay, that's helpful. So the membership indicates city councilors and budget committee members, but it doesn't indicate the number thereof.
No, it doesn't.
What is the suggestion?
So we would develop a list. Generally, in each category, we would probably want 2 to 3 max in each category. If you're thinking about budget committee members, city councilors, community members, looking at, the business and nonprofit community, because we want a broad representation on the team, but we don't want the team to be so large that it kind of hinders the conversation that needs to happen at the table.
So you kind of just answered my next question. And why don't we just make it an exercise, an extension of the budget committee where we include all budget committee members and all councilors? Is that the answer?
I guess what I was trying to say is the opposite would probably be preferable for the conversation. Typically, when we've had committees of this type or teams of this type, we've had subsets ask for interested participants from each of the committees. So because when the group is large, so if you have 16 members and then we add another 5 to 8 members of community members, it's a very large team. And it's hard to have a level of conversation and input to develop the recommendation. And again, this is a recommendation that comes back to the city manager, and then we bring it back to this body for further discussion.
Okay, my next question then would be when we have work sessions, because in the defining the team charge, the revenue team charge, it indicates the council will hold work sessions before the revenue team convenes to receive information on unfunded services and finalize the scope of services.
Mm-hmm.
Can the budget committee be part of those work sessions?
The proposal as before you would be for council to be part of them. Could you have a budget committee meeting where you considered and a recommendation was made to council? We certainly could incorporate something like that into the process. I think the current thinking with the budget committee was after the city manager prepares or proposes her budget and we provide more staff information at those meetings, there's also an input time in those meetings for budget committee members to give comments and feedback. to the whole budget committee based upon what they're hearing, which could then be incorporated into the council work sessions. I think that's what we were thinking of. If there was a desire for input or a recommendation from the budget committee for the council to then consider in developing the charge, we could structure that way as well.
Good. Alan, and then Lindsay, and then Mike.
Yeah, thanks for making that change. I think it's important to have a clear charter for the revenue team and purpose really clearly laid out for them, for that revenue team. Ultimately, for what we use the money, the revenue, and how much we create is a council decision, and having that up front, I think with public input, there'll be the budget committee process. People can come on. Then we have the forum. People can do that. There's regular communication channels that people have where they can chime in on that. That makes sense to me. It's ultimately not a budget committee decision. They can have a conversation. Matt's suggestion is basically make this be a budget committee meeting, and I think it really needs to be a council meeting. So thank you for this. I support the proposal.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and thank you for bringing this back to us. I actually had similar questions to Matt around the budget committee, kind of helping set priorities. Those questions have been answered, so I'm ready to move forward with voting on the revenue team, and I'm in support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. And counselors typically, if not by charter, are ex officio members of pretty much any committee as near as I understand it. So I guess my question, the way it was explained, I guess my question is to Sarah, if multiple or a majority of counselors wanted to attend and showed up for said meeting, you wouldn't turn them away, would you?
Unlikely.
That's kind of what I figured. So
If we know that there's going to be, we know there's going to be a quorum.
Yeah, so Councilor Clark, I'm not clear what you mean by every counselor is essentially an ex officio member. That I've never
heard, let me clarify, I've never heard of a counselor being turned away from any committee or any committee meeting. If
the meeting is not, it depends on how the meeting would be noticed. If the meeting was not noticed and operating as a public meeting in accordance with Oregon's public meetings law, and a quorum of counselors showed up, we would turn folks away, because now it would actually change now we've got a quorum of counselors that could be hearing information ultimately that they're going to be making a decision on, and it is certainly gray, but it's dark gray of where that is a public meetings law violation. So it really is. But if the whole thing is being noticed, even whether it had or didn't have, if in fact it was noticed as a public meeting and a majority of counselors showed up, there, no harm, no foul. That wouldn't be a problem because it was already noticed as a public meeting.
I don't want to hinder Sarah's ability to get the best information and to propose to us the things that we are most likely to approve and agree with. I don't want to hinder that process. But I do want to make sure that if there was a part I wanted to add and the only way to make sure that occurred was to attend, then I want to make sure I wouldn't be precluded from doing that. So I'm not sure how best to deal with that in this case. Maybe Sarah, you could, or Catherine, you could advise here.
Well, the process that we're proposing and the makeup of the committee is based on many years of experience of doing this, and the most recent being the Community Safety Initiative, where the group came around to the payroll tax, and we
precisely what I'm asking. There was an option
asked
for that did not
I
get
don't think
included.
I don't think there was any moments in that process where any of the counselors felt like they were being excluded or you weren't getting your ideas at the table. So I think it's a matter of how we work together going forward, that you're setting really clear priorities and a scope, and that I'm giving you regular updates on what we're learning and hearing so that you can provide that, feedback along the route.
Thank you. I'm sorry I jumped in early there. I apologize. there was during those meetings an option that I hope we will be considering this time around in enhanced invitations for voluntary annexation to the city. I'm hoping that will, and the revenue effects, I'm hoping that will be a part of this conversation. So I'm saying that out loud at first, but if it doesn't occur, I'll probably show up and want to talk some more. Thanks.
So, Mike, I would this is Lucy, just jump in for a second and say, if you really want to serve on this committee, you can let me know, because I'll be appointing folks, and that you as council, you will know who your representatives are on this, and you can also have those direct conversations with them. So you don't have to, this won't be in a black box for you where you have no idea what's going on. You have access to getting an update from your colleagues or participating yourself.
I appreciate that.
Okay, Emily.
Thank you. Thank you for all this work. We definitely need to find some revenue. I was on the payroll committee and it's a tough job. I learned a lot, and I learned that a lot of things won't work. So it's going to be a difficult process. My concern is a little more general, not just about this, but about a budget as a big picture. Our budget committee is really important, but it's an advisory committee. And I think sometimes there's a desire and an inkling to want to push policy in the budget committee, and that's not the place. So I want to be careful that as we form this committee, the members realize that it's time for brainstorming and getting opinions and information and coalescing that, but it's not their charge to decide this. It's advice. So I don't want people to be disappointed if they think they have more power here than they do.
Thank you very much for that. Alan, another round?
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Actually, it's a bit troubling that these revenue team meetings would not be open public meetings. How we spend the public's dollars and on what we spend it is clearly in public interest. And I think all of these meetings should be open public meetings and have to comply with the open meetings law. And I think that handles a bunch of problems that were just brought up. So I'm a little puzzled why they wouldn't be. And then my second comment is, as an author of the work session poll last year on revenue, I expressed my interest in that through that, and I would like to express my interest now as for serving on the revenue team as well.
Okay, noted. Thank you. All right, I have Jennifer and then Matt in the queue.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify, my understanding is when we're deciding what we want the revenue team to try to find funding for, those will be all public meetings, right? It's just so the part where that Alan was concerned about, we'll be doing that very publicly. It's just then, like with Emily and how we served on the revenue committee, once we decide, okay, we're going to spend it on street trees. This is just obviously an example. We would then send it on, hey, we need $5 million to fund street trees. Give us some advice on how the best way to do that would be. And that's the part that might, although we haven't 100% decided, I guess, be less public, which would then of course come back. Here's the recommendation I got. So they wouldn't see how the decision was made necessarily, except maybe part of the report, but they would find out what the advice was given on how to fund those street trees that we would then make a decision about.
It's not a policy-making committee at all. Right. It's basically a study group that's looking at all the different possibilities and ideas, and all of that is going to be presented in a public meeting. Okay. So it's essentially just how we're staffing it and how people are participating in that work.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to make sure because I'm comfortable with that. I'm less comfortable if that part was a little more hidden, but I think we've set that up very appropriately. I also like what's come back. I think the proposal is great. I really I think like when Emily and I did it, it's very similar. There were folks from the community, from I believe the budget committee and council, and it wasn't a large team like you were saying. So we really had a chance to really throw out ideas and hash through them. And sometimes they were terrible and we and we would get there pretty quickly. And so it just it was a good environment to be able to make those decisions and bring forward something. So I'm very supportive.
Okay, thank you. Matt.
Thank you, Mayor. I too have made my longing public about wanting to serve on the Revenue Committee and channeling my inner Phil Barnhart. Are all the committees noticed publicly?
It depends. Isn't that a fun lawyer answer? It depends. It depends on to whom the committee reports. So any sort of staff committee that reports to any, like our department advisory committees, all of those are not public bodies. And so they're not noticed as public meetings. To be noticed as a public meeting, it needs to be the convening of a public body. Now, what constitutes a public body could be a committee, but it needs to be either making a decision or a recommendation to another public body. So if you had a committee, the Ad Hoc Committee on Police Policy made a direct recommendation to you as a public body. Those were noticed and they were public meetings and held as public meetings because that committee itself became a public body because it was making a recommendation directly to you. Our Sustainability Commission, if they have committees that are making recommendations directly to the Sustainability Commission, those committees are also public bodies. But if it's a work group or if it's not making a recommendation or a decision, or if it's not making a recommendation or decision to another public body, those aren't public meetings and they do not need to be noticed as such.
Does the IGR committee, the Intergovernmental Relations, make a recommendation to this council? Public? So if it's public, why are we publicly noticing that meeting?
I don't know the specifics of IGR.
We are. Okay, sorry, we are.
We are noticing. Okay. So another counselor can observe the meeting. If it's publicly noticed, it's public,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So to Counselor Clark's observation that he's not aware of any counselor being told they couldn't participate in a meeting, I would submit that observing is some semblance of participation, and they've been turned away. I have walked in this very room at the start of an IGR meeting recently and been told that it would constitute quorum, that I couldn't even be in the room. If I could observe online and it's publicly noticed, why would we prevent counselors from sitting on a meeting? Am I missing something?
I don't know the answer to that. I certainly can dig in and you and I can talk. I wasn't aware of that situation or know the details of it, but.
I mean, I complied and I'm happy to because I don't want to trigger an open meetings violation. But if we're also making or if we're publicly noticing meetings and making them available online for everyone to observe, I would like to know more detail about what meetings are public, what constitutes participation. And I don't want to get off track, but Mike has piqued my curiosity about what committees beyond this proposed revenue team we can participate in without triggering an open meetings law violation. That would just be my kind of side, my deviation from the day. Thank you.
I will just say, Matt, that's a different conversation with IGR because it wasn't a public meetings law question there. It was your role in the legislature.
Oh, and
we were
so it's a
talking about legislative
Interesting.
policy. Yes, it was a slightly different issue.
Okay,
So,
that wasn't impressed upon me. Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I have Greg in the queue.
Thanks, Mayor. Just so that folks that are watching don't get confused about this. At the end of the day, with all of our committees and everything else, with the exception of the Planning Commission, all of this, the things that we discuss in these committees that are citizen-driven committees are advisory to the council. At the end of the day, the council is the only body that is charged with making decisions, except for the Planning Commission, which is in a quasi judicial role at certain times. So I hopefully I have quoted that right. But you know, we can observe these are open public meetings, but you know, as with the Budget Committee and with other committees, the Human Rights Commission, they are strictly there to provide background, give advice, do deeper dives on issues, and to help council formulate policy and ultimately vote on policy.
Thank you for that. Okay, Alan, one more round.
Yeah, I agree with what Greg just said and Emily said before that about the rules. In this process, the council, the way this is laid out, the council is going to do open public meetings, work sessions on what and how much to spend. But the discussion about the types of revenue sources or taxes or fees is, to me, of clear public interest. And all of this should be as open and as transparent as we possibly can. So I'm wondering what would be the rationale for having the revenue team discussions be behind closed doors?
Well, I guess that's not how I would characterize it. We'll have the public involved in it, and all of the materials would be put out to the public. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's behind closed doors. I think the feeling is it just takes a different level of staffing and support and notice and for all of the public meetings. So typically when we do things that are advising us, or we're working with landlords or tenants or all the different groups we bring together to get advice, we don't typically do that. But it's certainly a requirement the council could make. It just changes the conversation a little bit in terms of the formality and the staff support we'll need to provide to it.
Well, I would recommend that's the way we proceed to these open public meetings. Be as open and as transparent as possibly can in terms of our discussions and with the public and the community about what kind of revenue sources, taxes, or fees are on the table.
I'll just interject for a minute, because what I'm recalling about the community safety payroll tax conversation is that we received, and I think this has been true of all those others, there's a matrix that is a public document that is discussed at a council meeting that lays out all of the things the committee has considered and the pros and cons and where they are. And we heard that partway through the conversation, and then we heard at the end of the conversation. I don't think council was left out of any of the gruesome details of any of those conversations. But all right, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor, very much. I just want to say that I wholeheartedly agree with Alan. There are potential consequences for different revenue types that impact different people differently. And I would want anybody who has a thought that a potential revenue source may have a consequence for them to know it in advance and see it coming and be able to deal with it effectively in their personal advocacy, whether they were an elected official or not. And the reason that's important, there are many reasons that's important, but one of them is that oftentimes we get to the decision-making step of said committee works, and a lot of the arguments in the room will be, well, but we don't have any information on that because we didn't study it, or this is the recommendation of the folks who did all this work, and we need to respect that and go with their recommendation. And I always kind of push back at that a little bit when it's not a completely open process in the first place. So again, I agree entirely with Alan.
Okay. Council President.
It's time.
It is time.
I move to adopt the revenue team proposal as outlined in attachment A.
Second.
Okay, all in favor, please. Oh, sorry, you want to speak to it? Go for it.
I have it's a point of inquiry. In the revenue team process on the back of attachment A, we evaluate and develop potential revenue funding strategies to support the service areas defined in the scope developed by council. And then we develop a recommendation for the city manager detailing the findings of the team? Why do we not develop a recommendation to council?
So that's what I was trying to explain in the beginning. So there's code provisions around when and how committees are established by the council and all the sort of rules that go into effect about how people get selected, the scope, the timeline, the notice requirements. It's a different, they're advising you, they're not advising me. So it just triggers, like the ad hoc police, it triggers a different piece. They're essentially, we're staffing your committee. We've typically done revenue committees the other way. And part of that is because we're not working with established boards and commissions and people that have signed up. We're getting a broader group of people that we're trying to manage their time and schedule their time. And so some of the ways in which the meetings get scheduled and noticed get more challenging because we have to give so many days notice. And if a group of volunteers can't do it, it's just a little bit more challenging. It's easy, it's nimbler the way we've been doing it. So if you want to set it up as a council committee, the way you did police, you can do that. This is just the way we've done it in the past, and we found it to be really successful.
Is the what's in front of us in sync with what Mike and Alan are articulating?
No.
Well, having an open public meeting is distinct from whether or not it's a council or council committee or a city manager advisory committee. Because both things could be true. It could be a city manager advisory committee and be open public meeting.
Put it.
So I feel like I'm like searching for the right words here. We rarely turn people away from meetings, right? So if we're having a meeting and somebody brings their, friend or whatever, and they sit and observe, we don't typically go to the door and say, you can't come in here. The difference is we don't typically do the formal notice, send it out to everybody around meetings that are advising staff. We don't. We could. It's not in my recommendation, and that's why I said it's not the same, Councilor Zelenka, because we're planning to approach this the exact same way we did the group with the payroll tax. We got a lot of positive feedback on how that worked. And so if you want it to be different, that's not what is in this proposal. And so I'm just trying to be open and transparent about that.
Alan, one more comment.
Well, given that, I would move to amend to have the revenue team meetings be open public meetings.
Second. That received a second, I'm sorry.
Matt seconded it. Okay, any other conversation about this? Okay, all in favor of motion to amend, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4. Opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, and I will join the opposed. Okay, so we're back to the original motion. All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4. Wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and opposed 2. So it passes. Thank you very much. Thank you for the conversation and exploration, and we appreciate the work. And with that, we are adjourned.